This Forbin project started with the idea that I could make a quick boat by building it in 3D software and 3D printing slices, which was an idea to make things quick, but it didn't turn out so quick. But anyway, at the time I wanted to have a large boat because I had just built one from the ocean. I was in Florida at the time, so I needed something that had a little bit more space. But actually, when I designed this, I was back in Canada, and that was the first move of many moves that I did inside the country. So we can see the first element that I printed. I tried to print in heat-resistant PLA, but finally I printed normal PLA because it didn't work too well. So you can see the kind of length of the ship. It's 7 feet long, and I super glued it together, and this was the winter of 2022, I believe. One of the things that happened here is that I moved, and after moving during the summer, I was able to lay up some epoxy and some Bondo wood filler. The epoxy would serve the purpose of holding the shape together and also making sure that all the gaps are filled, that there's no water ingress, and also making sure everything is super smooth. So I got that epoxy from a surfboard shop, and I was able to also use a couple of layups of fiberglass cloth to make sure that everything was well smoothed and solid. One of the choices I made for simplicity is just to have the bow thrusters be static. So they're 3D printed in resin print, and they're actual real tunnels inside the bottom of the ship, but they don't provide any function except to look aesthetically pleasing. One of the big things that I wanted to do with this project is to control it with Arduino and NRF24. I did have plans to control it with GPS modes, to have LED modes, different engine mixes, to add in sounds, to add in gimbal and automatic stabilization, all that sort of good stuff. But finally, because of reliability, I did rip it out and replace it with a normal RC system. But we do see here that at that summer I had worked on that, and that I did have a working prototype at that point. At this point, I decided to take about a week off from work, and I kind of spent it at work, but I was doing the electronics. So I was able to, at the end of the week, bring it out for a float test and have it kind of battle tested for the first time, just seeing if it would actually run on the water. And right afterwards, we had a party, so we got together with another group of modelers, and I decided to just throw on some prototype cardboards and have the structures that I had completed, put them on there, and go out for a spin on the little pond. So we did that, and it was great. It was the first time that the boat was on its own power, and it was very stable, was working fine. The only issue was that often the electronics would disconnect, and I would have to go and turn it off again and turn it back on, then it would work. Probably because of a contact issue. But yeah, that's ultimately foreshadowing what would happen later. Something that did happen, not that summer, but the one afterwards, I didn't work too hard on the boat, but in the meantime, there was a flooding. The hurricane happened in Quebec in 2024, the most expensive one in history, and I got 6 inches of water in my basement. So they needed to rip out the basement where I lived. So I moved apartments from Terrebonne to Mascouche. And at that time, I started designing more parts for the 3D printer. The resin printer I purchased exactly for this purpose of making small detailed parts, and I zero regret the decision. It was the best thing ever because you can render parts that are very detailed. You can have eyelets in 1/72 scale. You can have bolts, all sorts of things that are a lot smaller than you could do in a traditional 3D printer. So it is a bit of a process because you have to do cleaning, and you have to make sure that it's not, in the room where you're living because it's very smelly. But I did go through that process, and you can see the resin is curing, UV, and all that stuff. And it takes a while. I did go through a lot of batches of designing things in Blender, then going to the printer, putting the supports and everything. So each one of them, it was an evening spent doing that, and then coming back. But at the end of the day, I was very, very happy with the parts that I got. It's at this moment that I started to see the vision coming together, because most of the decks were laid out and most of the 3D prints were starting to get done. So I set myself a goal that in 2026 in the spring, I wanted to be able to paint my boat and cover it entirely in gray. That was the effort that I was pulling towards during the winter of 2025-2026. I started being able to glue all the parts together and have it laid out as a prototype, which was really exciting. And cutting out the different panels, and also spending a lot of time adding some filler. I used some Tamiya putty filler to make sure that there were no gaps between joints, that everything was smooth, and spending a lot of time sanding. Because basically when you put one layer of gray, you want to make sure that there are no defects showing through. and they'll show through a lot if you don't cover them, so you want to make sure that you cover everything properly. And that's when one morning I just got up and decided, hey, I want to make the anchor box, because in photos that I see, there's an anchor box. And probably I was too tired to make accurate decisions that day, and I didn't quite cut at the right place, and I didn't quite make the right this and that. And also, one detail is that anyway, it's a panel that closes, so most of the time it wouldn't show. But hey, I figured it would add some visual interest, and honestly, I don't regret it one bit. At that time too, I took an interest in the bridge. At first, I thought I would just lay out some generic modules together and make a bridge, but I took a look at it and it was meh. So I decided to model the precise bridge as it is in real life, enough to be about 70% there, and I laid it out, and I think it looks great. And finally, one fine summer day, yes, a bit later than I had hoped for, I went past my deadline. I found some Rust-Oleum low odor premium matte dolphin gray paint, and I was able to spray paint the whole thing, including the ship and the structures. And that was one of the best moments in the build because it felt great. After the paint, in my eagerness, there were some details that I had omitted, but with a messy masking job, I was able to sand and repaint on top, and everything was good to go. So that was the end of that story. For the antenna, I just wanted to give an overview of how I designed most of the parts. First of all, I used the blender as a measurement opportunity, and as using that as a reference, I used some of the parts are resin. As you can see, some of it is brass, and some of it is some pieces of plastic tubing that I cut into the right lengths and drilled out holes and inserted them. I was hoping that would make things more durable, and for antennas that does work, but for this purpose they actually clipped right off when I went in the car at one point, so that didn't entirely work, but I think the concept was sound. And the antenna was one of the last major parts that was missing from the masts to make the model look complete. So that was a great achievement as well. And I also at that point added a lot of the details on top of the bridge where there are a lot of sensors and different boxes and stuff. Navies nowadays like to use rigid hull inflatable boats, also shortened as ribs. So they always come with these side garages, these destroyers. I created 2 of these in styrene, and I used styrene cement with I-beams to connect everything together, and used some extra 3D print that I had to add the visual interest and to make it semi-realistic. I tried to sort of imitate what it is like in real life, but not 100%. And I designed the crane as closely as I could with some inspiration from some pal figure cranes that I found online that looked similar to the one that was displayed on the ship. And there we go, that's the rib side garages. One of the lowest effort and highest reward things to do is to make some weathering effects. At my local hobby shop, I found some washes from, let's see, these are the Army Painter Quick Shade, I don't know. They were in a bin for sale, and it said if you took 4, you got a savings. So I got a flesh wash, a soft tone, and a light tone, and I used those at different places to create effects on the ship. It's especially because shadows in 72 scale are a lot smaller than they would be in real life, so they won't have as much time to get darker. So we use washes to kind of highlight different shadows, like for example the spaces between garage doors, or around just openings around doors of different kinds, or for bolts to show the bolt patterns and all that sort of stuff. So panel lines and bolts is sort of what I was using it for. You can get a special highlighting for that. But also I wanted to create some rust effects. And as you can see, well, there's just some dirt, grime, and rust effect going on that I'm using my fingers to promote. So using a different set of washes, at one point I also got a bottle of a specific color of fresh rust and added that as well. So when you layer a couple of these, they look pretty good when they hang out together, and you can get result that's pretty decent with honestly very little effort. It's not very hard or very technical to do. And I also made openings for the different places on the boat that have openings, and made that show, so what have you. At this point, the ship was looking pretty complete, and I just couldn't resist bringing it on the water. The only thing was that the controls were not responding well anymore. It had been a few years, I guess the leads had gotten corroded. And I tried getting a new PCB printed and soldering that, but it didn't work, and I didn't have time to deal with it. So I got very good shots, very good dusk shots and everything, but just not a working ship. For the markings on the boat, after some research, I went with Oracal 813, which is a type of vinyl that you can laser cut. With the pen tool and blender, you can transform shapes into the SVG format. And then the SVG format can be used to cut with the laser printer, which we happen to have at the office. And I used those decals as negative space, pulling out the characters and going with a sort of dry brush technique to make sure that the least amount of paint possible would seep through. I often went with a couple of layers, especially on the white. White is a little bit difficult to paint. And then afterwards, removed it. So that was the same for the helicopter deck as for the number markings, the pennant number, and the name of the ship. Finally, I tested my electronics one last time with a friend, and they failed again, and somebody had to swim in the disgusting algae to go get the boat. So I ripped out the thing and put in normal RC controls, and now it works, and it's zippy. And I'm looking forward to giving updates about the LED lighting, about smoke effects, potentially about sound, about different modes, and about additional details that needed to be added to the hull.